Start on time. Okay. I'm Eugene Wang. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay. I'm Eugene Wang. I teach Chinese art history here. And I want to welcome you all to this much anticipated event. Guests and people come from all over the world, from Beijing, London, Vienna, and most exotic of all places, California, to attend this event. The symposium is sponsored by the Rockefeller Fund for East Asian Art, Harvard Yenching Institute, and also, most importantly, with the total support from the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies and MFA, Boston. I want to take this occasion briefly to, but very importantly, to thank Lydia Chen, the Associate Director of Fairbanks Center, who has kept us in track and made everything possible. Where's Lydia? Oh, she's outside. Okay. And also to Alan Yung, who is our designated graduate student coordinator, who works around the clock and sending me emails 3 a.m. Expecting me to answer back. And Yin Yang, who is the double agent working for both MFA Boston and Harvard, and all our graduate students who make this event smooth and possible. The symposium is held in celebration of the opening of the exhibition, Fresh Ink 10 Takes on Chinese Tradition. And here I want to introduce the curator of the exhibition, Hao Sheng, or Sheng Hao, Tom Wu, curator of the Chinese art at MFA Boston. We take particular pride in presenting him today, as he is a product of the crucible of East Asian Art program at Harvard. Our core faculty consists of 3 musketeers, myself, Yukio Lipit, and Melissa McCormick. So today is Hao's homecoming day. In fact, he has never left. Charles River has never been Pacific Ocean, nor it will ever be. Here's Hao.
So I'm just going to say a few words, in 10 minutes, introduce the show very quickly. Because many of you probably haven't had a chance to see the show yet, I want to run through and introduce each of the artists and the works they have created. The slide starts with the work they have chosen, and then paired with the new work they have created. But before that, I would like to say a few words to thank our sponsors. The show couldn't be possible without the generous grants from the Whole Family Foundation, the United Technologies, and as well as the National Endowment for the Arts. And I also want to make an apology. We thought this boring Saturday conference, all-day symposium, wouldn't be very interesting for many people, and we didn't anticipate this much participation. It touches my heart, but also saddens me that many of you will have to sit in the other room, including my family members. And so our apologies, and thank you for your patience. Fresh Ink was conceived about 5 years ago when I first proposed to the museum, and it started with a very simple idea to invite artists to come to the museum, study our permanent collection. Each of the artists has, through a residency process, chose a work, and in response created a new work over the years. And when the show opened, it was the first time the old and new faced each other, while the old giving the context, the new offers new interpretations. Arnold Zhang, our only Chinese-American artist, and for that reason argued that he could choose a American masterpiece. Perhaps we can have the overlay down for the slides. That itself, I must say, is a coup for the success of the show and demonstrate the support from the museum, because when the museum is opening its American wing with a whole gallery dedicated, designed around this painting, we got to have it, and not only have it in our show, but lay it down on the table like a Chinese hand scroll. And in response, Arno created this wonderful ink monochrome landscape. And it certainly asks questions about gesture, about the way to look at paintings, the pairing introduced interesting ideas about gesture and how the familiar concepts in abstract expressionism can help American audience in particular to get into the depths of Chinese brushwork. Li Huayi came from San Francisco. He chose 9 dragons, and interestingly, as he said, well, I'm a landscape painter, it's very hard for me to take anything directly from the dragons. However, the 9 dragons, he described it as 回肠荡气. It resonates in my guts and in my belly. And that qi of qi yun shen dong, the energy that animates the painting itself, is the subject that he responded to. And here is the work. And this doesn't do justice to the enormous painting and then the many different distances you can view it. Li Jing, wonderful, the most jovial, happy person I have ever met, and also a person that no other artist exemplifies, that taking the life and enters into art so readily. You take him out for dinner, and the next day the foods are on the painting itself. And he chose this work not only for its importance, but also for the fact that the scholars had these oval faces and long beard, looked like him. And the character of his figure is so strong that 2 days ago when he first came to the museum to look at the paintings, even on his way, the audience already recognized him. Aren't you the... Aren't you? Yeah. Liu Dan now lives in Beijing, but many of you are familiar with him when he lived in this country. The preeminent painter of scholars' rocks, but I always remembered a conversation we had years ago with Bob and I and Liu Dan in Washington, D.C., in a restaurant called Odalisque. And he said, everybody thinks I'm a rock painter, but in fact, I'm really a landscape painter at heart. So this time, he created a landscape for us, but not without the rocks. Here is a rock on permanent loan from the Rosenblum family. And on the right is a portrait, on your right is a portrait of the rock itself. And what he could do for this time, because he was able to study it from all sides, 9 different facets, 9 different views of the rock were painted. And finally, that landscape enters into a long hand scroll and divided into 3 segments. And it starts with very much just like the rock entering into the painting horizontally, but went into valleys and the clouds and waterfalls, and eventually to a surface of abstract brushwork. It's a work from the mundane, the rock, eventually transports us to the spiritual. Liu Xiaodong, depicted in his studio, came to Boston 4 times to complete his projects. And what he has chosen is a work of unusual violence in the Chinese painting tradition, and that subject, violence, became the theme of his work. He painted 9 high school students from the Boston area and invited them to write down comments on violence where the colophon traditionally is. Qin Feng came from the furthest corner of China, from Xinjiang, but lives the closest to us in Chelsea, Boston. And through the way of Beijing, Berlin, and finally Boston. And the language, or the misunderstanding of language, the incomprehension of language, became the theme of his work. And he has chosen also the earliest work in this group of 9 classical pieces that artists have chosen for the fact that specifically for the inscription inside of the bronze. And what he has taken is that to say, what if, just like how we say, what if the wall could speak? He's saying, what if the bronze could speak, like a messenger came in from the past. And he is sitting at the spot where he wants the bronze to stand as an actor. He created a screen, almost like a stage set, and in front of it is this amphitheater of books. And the voice of the bronze is projected in many different kinds of strokes onto the book. But enough of theorizing, but what's most amazing is to walk around it and to let the energy of the painting, let the splash of brushwork move you. Qiu Ting is the youngest member of this group. When I invited him, he was only 34, and so now he's 39. And he has the distinction of a PhD degree from the Tsinghua University, not only in painting, and what it requires of him was to produce an exhibition of his own work, of his landscape, but also to finish a dissertation on Chinese painting history. And the major piece, the major artwork anchors his dissertation is Whiling Away the Summer at the Lakeside Retreat by Zhao Lingrang in MFA collection. So, you know, we had lots of trials anticipating artists' visit and try to think a strategy, how to minimize the time to show paintings before we hit the jackpot, before the artists really choose the work. And with many people, like Li Huayi, we wrote out our best best Northern Song monumental landscape painting attributed to Fan Kuan. And he looked at it and said, oh, that's very nice, and moved on, eventually chose 9 Dragons. But with Qiu Ting, we really hit the jackpot. The first painting we wrote out was his choice. And in the saying of 古人造化心源, the ancient, the nature, and the self as the 3 elements that compose the deeply thoughtful Chinese landscape. Qiu Ting introduced, of course, the 古人 is Zhao Lingrang. The 造化 came from the 8 great sites, an actual temple site outside of Beijing, where he sketches. And the Xingyuan is certainly the marvelous poetic brushwork in this work. Xu Bing, he really regrets he couldn't come. He told me that he already bought his tickets, but it was because of his administrative duties, he had to be pulled away the last minute. But he has sent us his contribution to today's discussion in a written essay. What he has done is taking, again, it's interesting when for the premise of the show is such that we roll out our treasures and say, go ahead and choose one. And he sidestepped all of them and chose something rather pedestrian, a mustard seed garden painting menu that everybody has been using starting the late 17th century. And the menu was cut and pasted into a long hand scroll format of a panorama. And that design is then carved into wood blocks and printed into a print. And that's the final product that we are showing. However, what I'm showing you, what's in red, are the testing stages, still not finalized. And in the Chinese tradition of woodblock prints, all the tests are done in red ink. Yu Hong, who paints women, and this time is not an exception. She remembers seeing court ladies refining newly woven silk when she was still a middle school student, seeing the slides in a dim classroom, wishing one day she could see the original. So one day she saw it, and there's no stopping her from choosing that right away And what she has done is to cast the 12 court ladies into contemporary women. And many of them actually showed up in her previous artworks before, so it became an index of her body of work, and collectively they tell a story of contemporary China from women's perspective. Zheng Xiaojun lives in Beijing and is not only a painter of trees and classical antiquity that he collects, but also a fine collector of furniture. And what he has done is to combine all these skills, kind of functioning almost like a 17th century Suzhou gentry who commissions the living environment around him. And what he has done here is to take the 9 dragons and imagine them as 9 trees. And furthermore, the 9 trees are again framed into a sumptuously produced screen with zitan wood. On the back of the screen, I don't think I have a slide here, are lacquer panels of the dragons. And imagine when the door closes and opens, the dragon and the trees become corresponds each other and reviews the correlations. So these are the 10 artists, and we will be talking about them all through the day, and I hope that warms you up for the next panel.
All right. No doubt this is going to be a landmark exhibition, and it sets a model in that it juxtaposes traditional and contemporary art in such a striking way. One of the remarkable things about this exhibition is its refusal to succumb to a common theme, that is the tradition-modern divide. And I think rightly so. The juxtaposition may create the impression that, in fact, it is playing on that theme, but note that there is only 10 takes on tradition and leave it at that. So I think that's a very good curatorial conception. Now, I want to take this occasion to critique the familiar common theme that runs through a lot of exhibitions in terms of this play on the tradition and modern divide, because that assumption has its problem, and it would create certain preferences, of course, because somehow there is this notion that the face of contemporary art should look certain way and not the other way. And you will probably see that when visitors to the gallery, the first thing they will probably drawn to in terms of looking for contemporary art is that probably would go to Qing Feng's work, which of course is very powerful work. But I wanted to say that Liu Xiaodong's work is just as powerful, and the problem that somehow the visitors carry that assumption has to do with this long-held conviction that somehow contemporary art ought to be avant-garde, and that and to be avant-garde is to have a radical break from tradition, and that I would say is a deep-rooted Western notion because it is very peculiar and singular European, Euro-American experience, and is not necessarily universal. And so the storyline underlying that kind of conviction is something like this. Actually, it could be summarized in 3 words: march towards flatness. That is, from the Renaissance art, the pictorial art developed a visual illusionism culminating in 19th century academic realism. And then around turn of the 20th century, the European avant-garde, the modernist, renounced that tradition and repudiated tradition. Therefore, the modern art was born with its interest in abstraction and flatness. So, as I said, this storyline is actually largely peculiar to the European situation. But if we play by the logic, we could say that China had modernism in the Song Dynasty, and actually there had been attempts by some critics and scholars to play this game. And it's in a way misguided, of course, because we know that you can't you can use one storyline to account for the complexity of different cultural scenes. In fact, throughout Chinese history, there are many moments of repudiation of tradition in intellectual level, but they don't necessarily go hand in hand with the artistic practice. And I want to show you a striking sample to see the disjuncture between the ideological repudiation of tradition and the artistic practice in a surprising way. We all know that the probably most radical political avant-gardism is actually Cultural Revolution, like it or not. And one of its masterminds is Hao Sheng, who happened to be a consummate calligrapher. So he engineered the most radical break in terms of repudiating tradition, but he actually is an avid collector of traditional Chinese painting and calligraphy, and he himself is actually a good calligrapher. And here is a calligraphy he wrote with the left hand. And as if to keep his ultra-leftist stance manifest, he holds the red book with the left hand as well. Another interesting moment in history is actually the first decades of 20th century, and there were two major seismic changes. One is that there is this political overthrow of the millennium-long tradition of imperial monarchy in 1911. Another is the May 4th movement that repudiated millennium-long Confucianism. So on those grounds, we have this sort of ideological, intellectual, or even political avant-gardism, but in the art scene is somewhat different because I show you here actually the same sheet, front side and back side. The front side is painted by Chang Yu, known as Sang Yu, and back side by Xu Beihong. Both went to Paris to try to catch up to study Western art. At that time, the drive is that to modernize China is to learn from the West. But the problem there is you have the different needs from China and West in terms of modernizing the painting. For China, from the China side, at least to the intellectuals at that time, painting was lagging behind in China because it didn't quite have the kind of technological edge as the European oil painting, which was perceived as a symptom of technological advancement. Whereas to the European side, they actually were fast shedding the academic realism to embrace more abstract, schematic, and geometric kind of painting. So each was looking to the other side for different needs. So you have one of the most paradoxical situations that one tradition is another modernity, and one's modernity is another tradition, and so on and so forth. So if you look at these two artworks, you will think that, of course, I mean, here's apparent that the Chang Yu in this comparison would strike you as the more conservative in the Chinese context, because he's clinging to tradition, and Xu Beihong was fast learning the Western technique of realism, which in China at that time was the modern. Whereas, of course, if you follow their trajectory, you will see that Chang Yu became the modernist in the European context, whereas Xu Beihong became the traditionalist in the European context. So the point therefore is that there is a shifting of frame of references, and you can't just stay with one narrative and judge different cultural situations. So in the same way, we shouldn't play that kind of same old modernist narrative about tradition and modernity and apply that to what we see here in terms of contemporary Chinese art. So I think the exhibition has this wonderful idea of aligning contemporary Chinese art with the traditional canon. But it's also very a clever decision in that it's not dwelling on the continuity and discontinuity line of thinking, because if you emphasize too much on the continuity side, you of course ignore the drastic change that has taken place in the intervening period. If you overemphasize continuity, you also belie some kind of anxiety about the rupture. So I think it's better to just leave that aside and just take these contemporary artworks on their own terms and along many narratives. Now, I also like the idea of 10 takes on tradition, and it kind of nicely play on the word in different sense of the taking on, taking a position, or even in filmmaking terms, take one, take two. So what bring these 10 takes together, I think, is the central focus. That is what I call the ink paradigm. Here, it's not so much the ink medium itself, but the ink medium as the ordering paradigm, because we do have among these 10 artists oil painters and other working in other medium. But nonetheless, I think the central paradigm there is the ink paradigm. And it's also notable that this exhibition takes place in 2010, and we have by now 30 years of contemporary Chinese art. So the history already has accumulated into 30 years. Now the story of contemporary Chinese art has began with oil medium, and oil medium embodies state ideology, and therefore in the postmodern era, to counter that state ideology or that ideology, you need a response in kind. And it's also remarkable that ink painting in what we perceive as contemporary Chinese art has taken a back seat. So you might want to ask why ink painting has not been made the darling of contemporary Chinese art in the international art circle. And the simple, well, there are all complicated answers to that. I don't have time to cover all the grounds, but just suffice to say that externally, it has to do with certain narratives and expectations from the art critics and the curators from the international art circle, who expect Chinese contemporary art to be a certain way, and oftentimes in a problematic way. And then internally, I would think that, as I mentioned before, that oil painting has always taken the pride of place in public life in China, is the official medium. And so for the avant-garde in the 1980s to come up against that, there was a need to counter the grandeur with grandeur. Now, the interesting thing happened that once the initial repudiation of the Maoist era was over, the avant-garde in the 1980s got more philosophical, and it turned to ink painting as a means of reflecting on long stretches of Chinese tradition, and not just Maoist era. So I show you here, actually, in the mid-80s, one of the catalysts is Liu Guosong from Taiwan, whose painting was exhibited in China, and his concept of ink painting brought the dimension of ink painting to a cosmic domain, a cosmic dimension. And so that actually inspired a lot of Chinese ink painters. And at the time, another notable figure is Gu Wenda, whose ink painting harmonized with Liu Guosong's in probing deeper into the spiritual and mental recess, and try to ask questions about the Chinese culture over a long stretch. Now, that had its moment. It was a very powerful moment, but one of the interesting and one of the mysteries that I've been keep pondering on is why some ink painters initially caught up in that moment and later give up ink painting. And one of the notable examples is Zhang Dali, who was trained and who was inspired by Liu Guosong's painting, but somehow gave up. And then he went to Italy, he somehow picked up this graffiti method, And then he went back to Beijing and started to do graffiti of this big head on the wall, which in a way is a multimedia attempt. So the question is, why did he give up? Or even the question is, did he ever give up? Did he reinvent the ink medium through this graffiti method, this big head, this sketchy head? And these are the questions we want to ponder. Now, the story, of course, of ink painting over the 30 years is complicated. I don't have time to go through, but I just want to line up four works of the recent years. I want to start with 2008 and the notable oil painters Chen Danqing actually used oil canvas to imitate Dong Qichang and Zhan Ziqian. And so that's an interesting move. And 2009, we have this, again, oil painter trying to recapture the kind of inky scene, and we all know where that comes from. And then the ink painting also takes hold of the animation and video medium, and you could see it became the main vocabulary for this animation, video animation. And that brings us to Yu Hong's painting in this current exhibition. That Yu Hong is a notable oil painter, but he used this special water-soluble acrylic on silver to capture, at least to give the impression, convey the impression, an effect of a certain inky quality, and thus thereby providing a fitting commentary to the painting of the lady preparing silk that was in the MFA collection. So, what's the story of ink then and now? I want to give a quick setup for the panels, and here's my probably idiosyncratic story. Since MFA is very strong in Song Yuan paintings, and I think it's very fitting for how to stage the exhibition in such a way that you have the Song Yuan and then the contemporary face-to-face. So, but nonetheless, it's interesting to reflect on the kind of narrative we can give to frame both body of work. And I come up with three narratives very quickly. And the first narrative is of ink painting is the opulent elegance versus spiritual austerity. And we could see that played out in the line of works of the court ladies preparing newly woven silk. And this is newly discovered carving from Xi'an. It would probably based on a scroll like this, but you could see that it has more elaborate landscape setting. And then by the time we get to the early 12th century, that gives you the idea of the old concern of opulent ease and aristocratic taste laid out in full color. And then about 50 years later, you could see that the commoners or the local painters and patrons start to push the boundary a little bit. And here you have the demons parodying this lady preparing silk. And this is actually a very touching painting because it's actually, the patron is a woman. And he was using this painting to commemorate the death of her family members and deceased family members. So the implied rhetoric is probably that he wished that in the cold netherworld, his family members could still get clothes. But therefore, it actually embodies a woman's point of view. And when another 50 years later, you could see that finally reached the ink medium where that color spectrum is dropped, and you have the monochrome taking over altogether, and the whole thing is couched in this austerity, which the ink medium is ultimately about. So that gives you the sense of these two polarities and the development from color to monochrome ink. And we can see how Yu Hong's painting recapitulates some of the old concerns, but it has particular relevance in this, in some kind of ironic opulence, and that's very fitting for the current consumerist age. And I wouldn't dwell on that, so we will have a panel discussion devoted to that, to spend more time talking about this painting. The second narrative I give is, again, since Xu Bing says Chinese love to use 4 characters to reduce complexity into manageable nuggets, so the second storyline is monumental outlook versus hazy absorption. And Qiu Ting's work, obviously, is a take on Zhao Lingran's Summer Mist. And to understand the Summer Mist of 1100, one need to understand the whole, what it is repudiating or what is departing from. And what is departing from that is whole, almost a century-long tradition of monumental landscape painting. And that is, the rhetoric therein is it goes something like this. This old tree tends to be a play on the pun of timber, meaning both, or cai, meaning both timber and talent. So often the lament is that the talent goes unused, and there's a state edifice that, talented as I am, I'm not being put to that use. So oftentimes they will have temples and structures there, but by this time, you could see that it's increasingly developing into this kind of foggy landscape, and so foggy that, in fact, you don't see some of the figures here that you can see, and also a little structure there. But in any case, that prepared the way for this departure of this from the vertical to the horizontal, from the more stately concerns to the private lyrical vision. And that, in a way, is played out in our exhibition in this kind of opposition. Of course, I'm not doing justice to their painting because you could see they continue some of the narratives, but it also expose the limitation of the narrative. And thirdly, finally, the story of ink painting is what I loosely translated as 教校路障, the expressive theatricality. This phrase is period term because it was debated at the time. You know, there was certain kind of painting that has this quality, or poetry has that quality. And then there's another kind of poetry and painting has a different quality. And it was debated in the 13th century, which is better. And of course, we can plug that into, then in that context, you start to understand this sort of more self-effacing as a kind of painting, and then more this kind of loud, theatrical, expressive kind of painting. And then you see the more extravagant kind of painting versus this totally self-effacing, quiet kind of painting. So these polarities are kind of played out in the opposition between, I'm not saying 清风 is 教校怒张, I'm just using the period term, because that is, the term itself has a period taste and prejudice and bias. But you could see at least it is very loud, visibly, and Xu Bing is totally quiet because he wants to basically hide his own voice and use a manual to construct a picture that has absence of the self. So I set up the paradigms and scenes and narrative in a way, so let's start, get the ball rolling. Okay. Thank you. And our first panel chair is Kama Hinton, who's going to introduce the panelists.